The Edwardian era, stretching from 1901 to 1910 and lingering in spirit into the years just before the First World War, is often remembered for its calm rituals, its manners, and its deep attachment to routine. Among its many customs, none was so quietly significant, so deeply layered with detail and expectation as the ritual of afternoon tea. To the guest who arrived at 4 o'clock, the scene might appear effortless, a table draped in fine linen, polished silver gleaming in the pale light, cups and saucers arranged with care and steam rising from a waiting teapot. Yet behind this delicate performance stood hours of preparation, carried out by the silent work of servants, whose lives revolved around order, discipline, and the exacting standards of etiquette. To understand the beginning of an Edwardian tea table, one must step not into the drawing room, but below the stairs into the servants' quarters. Here the day's work began early. The butler, the highest-ranked servant, oversaw the order of tasks, though the bulk of the labour fell to the footmen, housemaids and the kitchen staff. The morning hours were spent not merely in cooking, but in the polishing of cutlery, the pressing of linens, and the careful checking of every piece of porcelain that might later grace the table. Even the faintest chip on the rim of a teacup, or the smallest stain on a napkin, could bring embarrassment upon the household if noticed by a guest. The table itself was the stage upon which this ritual would unfold, and so its preparation demanded quiet precision. A cloth of white or ivory linen was laid down first, ironed to perfect smoothness. Unlike a dinner table, which called for the full display of forks, knives and elaborate arrangements, the tea table required a balance between simplicity and elegance. Servants placed a low arrangement of flowers, rarely scented, for strong smells were thought to interfere with the appreciation of tea, at the centre. Around this nucleus, the cups and saucers were set in neat circles, each handle aligned at the same angle, a detail invisible to most but essential to proper service. The silver teapot was not placed immediately, the hot tea must be fresh. Instead, its stand was set, along with the cream jug, sugar bowl and small silver tongs used for sugar lumps. The butler or footman polished each piece until it caught the light with a subdued sheen, never garish, for modest elegance was the true mark of refinement. Nearby, plates were arranged for the food that would later arrive from the kitchen. Thin sandwiches, small cakes and scones wrapped in napkins to keep their warmth. Every object had its place, and that place was dictated by tradition as much as by convenience. It was in the small details that the servant's work was most apparent. A napkin folded wrongly, a spoon placed at the wrong angle, or a cup mismatched to its saucer could be a subtle humiliation. To avoid such errors, the housemaids often rehearsed the layout under the supervision of senior staff. The butler might walk around the table, silent but observant, checking the spacing between each plate with the width of his hand, adjusting a cup here or there, and ensuring that everything aligned with invisible but unyielding standards. The preparation extended beyond the table itself. The drawing room, in which the tea was usually served, had to be aired and arranged hours before. Curtains were drawn just enough to let in a soft light, never too bright, for tea was meant to be a gentle interlude in the day. Chairs were arranged so that conversation might flow easily, and the fireplace was checked to see whether a fire was needed depending on the season. Servants dusted every surface, polished the mirrors, and checked the carpets for lint or stray threads. The setting had to appear effortless, but that effortlessness was itself the result of endless care. Even the tea leaves, those small fragments of dried plants, required attention. In the butler's pantry, tins of tea were kept under lock, for they were costly and precious. The housekeeper or butler measured them with care, sometimes blending different leaves to suit the mistress's preference. In Edwardian London, popular blends included Darjeeling, Ceylon and Assam, each carrying subtle notes that demanded precise brewing. Too long in the pot, and the tea turned bitter. Too short, and it lacked strength. The water itself had to be freshly boiled, for water that had been reboiled was said to spoil the taste. Thus the servants prepared not only the table, but the very soul of the ritual, the tea itself. The hierarchy of labour was always visible in the process. The kitchen maids prepared the food, working from recipes that balanced delicacy with tradition. The footmen carried trays upstairs, placing them on sideboards until the moment of service. The butler, dignified and calm, orchestrated the scene, though he rarely lifted more than a hand. It was a dance of silent cooperation, though each step had been practiced so many times that it seemed natural, though it was anything but. For the servants, there was little glory in this labour. Their work was noticed only when it failed, yet they carried it out with the discipline of those whose livelihood depended on invisibility. The guest might admire the gleam of a silver sugar tongue or the neatness of a folded napkin, but the hands that had polished and folded remained unseen. The very success of the tea table lay in the erasure of the labour that produced it. To imagine the final moments before the tea began is to see a scene suspended in quiet tension. The table stood ready, the cups waiting, the napkins folded, the silver gleaming. In the pantry, the teapot steamed faintly, ready to be carried in at the right moment. Footmen stood just beyond the doorway, waiting for the bell that would summon them into the room. The mistress of the house might glance at the arrangement, perhaps adjusting a flower or moving a plate by an inch, but for the most part the work was done. What remained was the performance itself, in which she would preside as hostess, while the servants ensured that every gesture unfolded with precision. And yet one cannot help but wonder how much of the Edwardian tea ritual belonged to the hosts, and how much to the servants who made it possible. If the table was a stage, then surely the unseen actors below the stairs deserved recognition. The guests, sipping their tea and commenting on politics or fashion, rarely thought of the hands that had pressed the linens or polished the spoons, but without those hands, the ritual would have collapsed into disorder. The preparation of the Edwardian tea table then was more than a household chore. It was a quiet testament to structure, discipline, and the invisible threads that held society together. Every fold of linen, every polished surface, every measured spoon of tea spoke of a world in which order was both expected and enforced. And though the ritual has long faded, the memory of that preparation still lingers in the details left behind. The worn edges of a teapot, the faint crease in an old napkin, the smell of polished silver. Yet we might ask, when the guests lifted their cups, did they ever taste the labour behind the tea, or was it forever hidden beneath the calm surface of etiquette? If Section 1 brought us into the servants' quarters and showed us the precision of preparation, Section 2 must take us deeper into the rhythms of the day, the chain of events that led from morning work to the actual performance of afternoon tea. To understand the Edwardian tea ritual fully, one must walk through the clock itself, tracing each step, each responsibility, and each subtle rule that made the ceremony appear so seamless. The day of a large Edwardian household began early. Long before the mistress of the house rang her bell, the maids had risen in the grey light of morning to sweep, dust and light fires. The work of preparing for afternoon tea was not isolated to the hours just before 4 o'clock. Instead, it was woven into the day's chores, like a thread that stretched from dawn until dusk. A housemaid might polish silver in the morning, her fingers blackened by the paste, while another pressed linens until the faintest crease lay flat. Every task seemed small in isolation, but together they formed the invisible scaffolding upon which the ritual rested. By midday, the kitchen hummed with quiet activity. Tea cakes were mixed, scones prepared, and sandwiches cut into precise rectangles with edges as neat as geometry itself. There was no room for irregularity. Cucumber slices had to be even, butter spread thin, and bread trimmed just so. A guest might never notice the perfection of a sandwich's corner, but they would certainly notice its absence. Behind the green baize door, cooks and kitchen maids worked without fanfare, the air thick with the smell of baking. For them, the afternoon tea was less a ceremony and more another item on the endless list of duties that defined their service. Meanwhile, the footmen rehearsed their movements. To carry a tray of fragile porcelain required balance and practice. A single stumble could ruin not only a table but also a reputation. The butler, always precise, sometimes reminded them of posture. The shoulders square, the steps measured, the tray level with the chest. It was not enough to carry. One had to carry with dignity. In the Edwardian household, dignity was a performance even among those who served. The mistress herself played a role, though hers was largely supervisory. She might instruct the butler on which tea blend to serve or remind the cook of a guest's preference. Yet once the servants had begun their work, she withdrew, trusting that the house would move in its practiced rhythm. To her, the tea was an opportunity for hospitality and status. To the servants, it was another test of precision. As the clock inched toward 4, the transformation of the drawing room began. Rugs were smoothed, chairs adjusted, and fresh flowers arranged in vases. Each item had to strike a balance, comfortable but not too casual, elegant but not ostentatious. Afternoon tea was not meant to overwhelm, as a grand dinner might, but to comfort and reassure. It was an oasis in the day, marked by calm conversation and unhurried gestures. By 3:30, the trays of food emerged from the kitchen. Sandwiches were arranged in neat spirals, scones placed beneath cloth to keep their warmth, and cakes cut into delicate slices. The servants did not eat from these trays. Their food was separate, plainer, and far less adorned. Yet their hands arranged every detail with care, knowing that their mistress's reputation rested on their work. A guest who left dissatisfied might never say so directly, but word could travel quickly among social circles, and even the smallest slip could carry consequences. At last, the teapot was prepared. Water boiled, tea measured, leaves steeped. In the pantry, the aroma filled the air, rich and fragrant. The butler checked the strength, pouring a small amount into a cup, testing it with the practiced eye of a man who had done this 1,000 times. If it was too strong, more hot water was added. If too weak, it was left to steep another minute. Timing was everything. Tea could not wait. It had to be served fresh, at the moment when its flavour was full and balanced. When the bell rang, the footman entered the room. Their steps were quiet, their presence discreet. They carried trays as though they floated, placing them on the table without a sound. Guests might glance, nod, or even ignore them altogether. Such was the paradox of service, to be utterly necessary yet socially invisible. The butler remained near, directing the flow of service with subtle gestures. A raised eyebrow, a glance, the tilt of his head. These were the signals by which the household staff communicated without words. Once the guests were seated, the mistress presided over the pouring of tea. Here, etiquette dictated that she served first, demonstrating both hospitality and authority. The servants ensured that the cups were passed smoothly, that the sugar bowl was within reach, and that no guest was left waiting. The butler's eye swept the room, catching small details. A guest's cup nearly empty, a plate that needed replenishing, a spill to be discreetly cleaned. To him, the tea was a symphony, and he was its conductor. Yet beneath this polished surface lay the quiet reality of labour. The housemaid, standing just outside the door, listened for the call. If more hot water was needed, they carried it quickly. If a plate was empty, they fetched another. Their presence was felt only in the smooth continuation of the ritual, never in interruption. They were like shadows moving at the edge of vision, vital but unseen. It is worth pausing to consider the emotional life of these servants. For the guests, afternoon tea was leisure, a moment of calm conversation. For the servants, it was work layered upon work. They rarely sat during these hours, and when they did, it was only after the last guest had departed, when the crumbs were swept, the cups washed, and the silver returned to its cabinet. The tea that symbolised refinement for one class symbolised labour for another. Still, pride existed in this work. A butler who maintained flawless service earned quiet respect, both within the household and among his peers. A housemaid whose linens were spotless gained favour with the housekeeper. For many, service was not simply duty but identity, a role inherited from generations before. In Edwardian England, one's position was often fixed, but within that fixity there was dignity and competence. To prepare a perfect tea table was to demonstrate mastery of a craft, however invisible it might seem to those above. As the guests departed, thanking their hostess and stepping back into the streets of London, the servants began the work of dismantling the scene they had so carefully arranged. The cups were gathered, the linen folded, the silver wiped free of fingerprints. The drawing room was restored to its quiet order, ready to be used again for another occasion. By evening, it would seem as though nothing had happened at all. Yet for the servants, the day's rhythm had been shaped around this brief hour of ceremony. The Edwardian tea ritual thus revealed not only the surface of social grace, but also the machinery of labour hidden beneath. It asked the question, who truly created the elegance that guests admired? The mistress who presided, or the servants who polished, carried, and prepared every detail? The ritual of afternoon tea endures in memory as one of refinement, but perhaps its truer story lies in the unacknowledged work that sustained it. Without the servants' invisible labour, the calm surface of etiquette could never have existed. And so we are left to wonder, when history remembers the elegance of Edwardian society, does it remember those who made that elegance possible? The ritual of afternoon tea in Edwardian London was more than a social event. It was a reflection of an entire social order. The preparation, the service, and even the dismantling of the tea table spoke to a society structured by hierarchy, bound by etiquette, and defined by a quiet but relentless expectation of perfection. To end this story, we must step back and look at the broader meanings behind this seemingly simple act. For in the ordinary lies the true weight of history. By the early 1900s, afternoon tea had long since become a marker of respectability. What had begun in the mid-19th century as a small refreshment for fashionable ladies grew into a household ritual, adopted by the middle classes and perfected by the aristocracy. The Edwardian period refined this custom into something almost ceremonial, where every gesture was dictated by unwritten rules. Yet what appeared effortless was the product of hidden effort. The servant polishing the silver at dawn, the maid ironing the tablecloth, the cook slicing sandwiches, these were the invisible architects of refinement. For the mistress of the house, the tea table was a stage on which she demonstrated her social grace. She poured tea with steady hands, engaged her guests in polite conversation, and offered delicacies that revealed both her taste and her means. Guests judged her not only by her manner, but also by the smoothness of the ritual itself. Was the tea strong enough? Were the cakes fresh? Did the servants move quietly and efficiently? Each detail contributed to a silent evaluation, and success required absolute harmony. But harmony was not spontaneous. It was engineered. In this sense, the Edwardian tea ritual mirrored the larger society that produced it. The upper classes appeared to float above labour, yet their very leisure depended on the invisible exertions of those below. Just as the tea table required the careful alignment of cups and spoons, so too did Edwardian society require the alignment of social classes, each in its expected place. Servants were trained to be invisible, yet they held the structure together. Without them, the ritual and the illusion of effortless elegance would collapse. The symbolism of tea went further. It was a drink brought from abroad, imported through the vast networks of empire. The leaves that filled the silver caddy had travelled thousands of miles from plantations in India, Ceylon or China. Their journey carried with it the weight of colonial trade, labour and exploitation, though these realities rarely entered polite conversation in the drawing rooms of London. To sip tea was to partake in empire, though for the Edwardian hostess the focus lay on presentation, not origin. Still, history lingers in the smallest details. In the tin of Darjeeling, guarded by the butler, in the sugar lumps carried from Caribbean plantations, in the porcelain imported from Asia. The tea table, though domestic, was global in its reach. For the servants, the daily repetition of tea preparation carried a different meaning. It was not a performance of status, but of duty. Each task, folding a napkin, aligning a spoon, replenishing a cup, was small, almost trivial, yet carried the weight of discipline. They lived in a world where mistakes could mean dismissal, where a single broken cup might cost more than a week's wages. And yet, within these constraints, many took pride in their work. To present a flawless table was to show competence, to hold one's place in a demanding hierarchy. This duality, leisure for some, labour for others, captures the essence of Edwardian society. Afternoon tea may appear at first glance as a quaint ritual of cakes and conversation, but beneath the surface lay the structure of class, empire, and expectation. The drawing room was the visible part of the iceberg. The servants' hall, the kitchen, and the butler's pantry were the unseen depths that supported it. As the Edwardian era came to its close, this ritual began to change. The First World War disrupted the rhythms of domestic life. Servants left households to work in factories or serve in the military, and many never returned to service. The strict hierarchies of the great houses weakened, and the leisurely afternoon tea, once a marker of stability, became harder to sustain. Hotels and tea shops rose in popularity, offering a more democratic version of the ritual. What had once been a private performance of status became a public leisure activity, accessible to a wider middle class. And yet, even as the context changed, the memory of Edwardian tea remained. In the quiet perfection of its table setting, one sees a microcosm of an entire age, an age that valued order, grace and appearance, even at the cost of labour hidden from view. To sit at an Edwardian tea table was to be cradled by invisible hands, to partake in a ritual that blurred the line between comfort and control. The story of how servants prepared that table is therefore not just a story of linens and silver, it is a story of structure, of the unseen foundations upon which societies rest. The gleam of the teapot reflected not only the faces of the guests, but also the hands of those who polished it. The neatness of the sandwiches carried the labour of cooks who remained in the shadows. The silence of service was not emptiness, but discipline, a discipline that made possible the illusion of effortless grace. Today, when we look back on the Edwardian tea ritual, it is easy to remember the elegance and forget the labour. But history is not complete without both. The table was beautiful because it was prepared with care. The ritual endured because countless servants rehearsed it day after day. And the society that cherished it was held together by those who worked unseen, ensuring that every detail fell into place. So the next time we picture an Edwardian drawing room at 4 o'clock, with sunlight slanting through the curtains and steam rising from a silver teapot, we might ask ourselves, are we seeing the ritual itself, or only its surface? What stories remain hidden in the folds of the linen, in the polish of the silver, in the quiet footsteps of those who served? The Edwardian tea table was not simply a table. It was a mirror of a world now vanished, a world where grace depended on invisibility, and where the beauty of an afternoon rested upon the labour of hands that history too often forgets. Behind every polished teacup and whispered step, the silent labour of butlers and footmen shaped Edwardian elegance, stories hidden in every pore. In the Edwardian household, the butler was more than a servant. He was the axis upon which order turned. His presence was steady, his movements deliberate, and his silence as commanding as any spoken word. Beneath him, the footmen moved like shadows, visible only in passing, their footsteps muffled against the carpets, their tasks carried out with an elegance that belied their effort. Nowhere was this silent choreography more evident than during the service of afternoon tea, that seemingly simple ritual, which in truth demanded a level of discipline and control rivaling the grandest of banquets. To the casual guest, the butler and footman were hardly noticed. Their duty was invisibility, to serve without drawing attention, to ensure that every need was met without the host or hostess lifting a finger. Yet invisibility was not absence, it was skill, honed through training and expectation. Every gesture, the angle at which a cup was presented, the pace at which a tray was carried, the moment at which a door was opened, was calculated, practiced, and refined. To watch them closely was to see the quiet art of service, where silence carried meaning and restraint was a language in itself. The butler's authority stretched over every detail of tea service. It was he who unlocked the silver cabinet in the morning, checking each piece for polish, setting aside any that bore the faintest blemish. It was he who oversaw the preparation of the tea itself, ensuring that the leaves were measured with precision and the water brought to a proper boil. While the cook and maids prepared the food, and the housekeeper supervised the linens, the butler orchestrated the entire performance, invisible to the guests yet omnipresent to the staff. His presence was a reminder that perfection was not optional, it was expected. Beneath him, the footmen carried out the physical work. Their role demanded strength, but not the kind that was seen in labourers on the street. Rather, it was a strength disguised in elegance, the ability to carry heavy trays without strain, to stand for hours without shifting, to move swiftly but never appear hurried. A footman's posture was as important as his efficiency. Shoulders straight, chin level, gaze lowered but attentive. His very stance reassured the household that order reigned. Training for this role was relentless. Young men entering service learned to walk with measured steps, to turn without hesitation, to handle porcelain as if it were fragile bone. They practiced pouring tea without a single drop spilling, arranging cups so that handles faced the proper way, and presenting dishes with a bow so slight it was almost unseen. Every mistake was corrected, sometimes harshly, for in the Edwardian world of service, failure was not an option. Guests might forgive a burnt cake or a dull conversation, but they would not forget a clumsy servant. The silence of the butler and footman was not empty. It carried weight, a kind of presence that filled the room, even as it sought to be unnoticed. When the butler entered, his authority was felt in the way others adjusted themselves, even unconsciously. His silence was not the absence of voice, but the presence of discipline. A glance from him could correct a misstep, a nod could send a footman moving, and the lack of any gesture at all could freeze a servant in his place. Afternoon tea was, in many ways, the butler's stage. Though the hostess presided over the table, it was the butler who ensured the smooth unfolding of the ritual. He stood slightly apart, never intruding on conversation, yet always alert. His eye swept the room, noticing what others ignored. A guest's empty cup, a saucer slightly misplaced, a sugar bowl growing low. The footman, trained to read his subtle signals, moved accordingly. Together they formed a silent symphony, a harmony of service that unfolded without a word spoken. The importance of this silence cannot be overstated. In a society obsessed with etiquette, servants were expected to vanish into the background. To speak was often forbidden unless spoken to. Even footsteps were muffled, for carpets were chosen not only for beauty but for the way they absorbed sound. The butler and footmen were trained to exist in this quiet, to become part of the atmosphere of the room rather than distinct figures within it. Guests might leave a tea praising the elegance of the occasion, yet never recalling the faces of the men who made it possible. But within this silence lay stories of endurance. Footmen, often chosen for their height and appearance, stood for hours, their legs aching, their hands stiff from carrying trays. The butler, often a man of middle age, bore the weight of responsibility, knowing that his position was both respected and precarious. A mistake could end a career, yet flawless service rarely brought reward beyond continued employment. The dignity they maintained was self-fashioned, built from pride in precision, and an identity forged in silence. To imagine an Edwardian tea without them is impossible. The hostess might preside, but without the butler and his footmen the illusion of effortless elegance would collapse. The cups would not arrive at the right moment, the teapot would grow cold, and the harmony of the ritual would break into disorder. The silence of the butler and footmen, then, was not absence. It was the very structure upon which the ritual rested. And yet one must ask, when guests praised the grace of an Edwardian tea, did they ever realise that its success depended not on conversation, not on cakes, but on the silent choreography of those they were trained not to notice? To truly understand the butler and footmen at the Edwardian tea table, one must look beyond the drawing room. Their presence at service was only the visible part of a life shaped by hierarchy, discipline, and the quiet demands of a world that held them to the highest standards while asking them to remain unseen. Section 1 showed us the outlines of their duties. Section 2 leads us deeper into their routines, the training that defined them, and the weight of silence that framed their existence. The butler was the undisputed head of male domestic staff, and with that position came both authority and burden. He did not labour in the same way as a maid scrubbing floors or a cook preparing meals, yet his role was no less taxing. His domain extended to the wine cellar, the silver cabinet, and the household's ceremonial face. At tea, it was his responsibility to ensure the ritual unfolded without flaw. That meant more than arranging objects or signalling footmen. It meant anticipating problems before they arose, managing staff without disrupting order, and maintaining the dignity of the household in ways too subtle for most to notice. The footmen, on the other hand, lived lives of physical precision. They were chosen for appearance as much as for skill. Tall, broad-shouldered, and often striking in their livery, they were part of the display of refinement. Guests did not acknowledge them, yet their very presence conveyed the wealth and standing of the household. To afford multiple footmen was to signal prosperity. The livery they wore, gold trim, polished shoes, immaculate gloves, was as much a symbol of status as the silverware they carried. Yet beneath the livery was a man, trained to silence his own presence, to become an extension of the household, rather than an individual within it. Their training was exacting. New footmen learned posture before they learned service. They practiced walking with trays of sand-filled glasses balanced on them, so that not a single vibration disturbed the arrangement. They rehearsed the placement of cups and plates until muscle memory guided their hands. They were instructed never to turn their back to a guest, never to cross a room without awareness of where every eye might be, and never to forget that they themselves were not part of the event. Service was about absence, about facilitating others' comfort while erasing one's own. The butler's silence carried with it a particular weight. His authority did not come from volume but from restraint. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in measured tones, with words carefully chosen. To the staff, even his pauses carried meaning. A raised brow could correct a misstep. A deliberate stillness could communicate disapproval more clearly than a reprimand. Among guests, his silence was part of his dignity. He existed at the edge of vision, a presence felt but not discussed. In this way, he mirrored the very nature of Edwardian society, which depended on invisible labour to sustain visible grace. At the tea table, this dynamic played out in countless small ways. A guest might reach for sugar, and a footman would appear at their side, presenting the bowl before the hand had even extended fully. A plate of sandwiches, growing light, would be replenished before the last one vanished. Cups cooled were quietly exchanged for warm refills, all without interrupting conversation. The art of service lay in anticipation. Enacting before need became request. To succeed meant to vanish. To fail meant to be noticed. It was a paradox that defined their world. For the butler, each tea was both a performance and a test. He was judged not only by his mistress, but also by his peers in other households. News of a clumsy service could travel quickly among employers. A butler known for flawless presentation became a prized figure, courted by other houses. His reputation, invisible though it seemed, was currency in the competitive world of domestic service. To maintain that reputation, he demanded perfection from his footmen, whose labour, though less acknowledged, carried equal risk. A footman who stumbled or spilled might find his employment terminated, his uniform stripped away, and his prospects dimmed. Yet despite these pressures, there was pride in the role. Many footmen, though bound by silence, took satisfaction in the elegance of their movements, in the way a tray balanced effortlessly on their palm, or in the gleam of the silver they carried. Their lives were narrow, confined by duty, but within that narrowness lay a kind of artistry. Service, though invisible, was a craft. The tea table, with its delicate porcelain and polished silver, was their canvas, and silence was their medium. Still, one must not romanticize their condition. Wages for footmen were modest, and advancement limited. They were often young men who had left rural villages to seek work in the city, drawn by the stability of service but aware of its constraints. The butler, though commanding within the household, remained a servant in the eyes of society. His dignity was recognised within narrow walls but vanished beyond them. The silence that defined their service was not merely chosen. It was imposed, the condition of their survival in a world that prized their invisibility. The ritual of tea, then, reveals more than etiquette. It reveals a social order maintained by silence. The butler and footman embodied this truth. They moved, without words, anticipated without acknowledgement, and carried the weight of grace without the credit. Their silence was both shield and burden, both the mark of professionalism and the condition of erasure. As we observe them, standing at the edges of the Edwardian drawing room, we are left to wonder, when the guests praised the elegance of the tea, did they realise that the truest elegance belonged to the silent men who made it possible? Or did silence itself ensure that their work would be forgotten, even as it defined the very experience that history now remembers? By the time the last guest had drained their cup and the gentle murmur of conversation faded into the corridor, the butler and his footman remained at their stations. For the household, afternoon tea was over. For the servants, the work had only shifted to its quieter stage. Cups were gathered, crumbs swept from plates, silverware returned to its case, and the room restored to order. The silence that had defined their service did not end with the ritual itself. It extended into the clearing away, into the resetting of the room, into the unbroken continuity of duties that stretched across the day. To understand the legacy of butlers and footmen in Edwardian tea service, one must see them not simply as attendants, but as guardians of an ideal, the ideal of effortless grace. Their silence was not an accident, nor merely a rule of etiquette. It was the very mechanism by which this ideal was preserved. In silence, they erased themselves from the scene, allowing the ritual to appear spontaneous, natural, and without labour. Yet history teaches us that nothing effortless is truly without effort, and nowhere was this more evident than in the butler's watchful presence and the footman's tireless precision. The butler himself carried the weight of continuity. Many had risen through years of service, beginning as footmen, learning discipline through repetition, and eventually ascending to a role that demanded authority cloaked in humility. In this, the butler embodied Edwardian society itself, hierarchical, stratified, and bound by unspoken rules. He was a servant, yet in the servants' hall he commanded respect. He was invisible to the guests, yet essential to their comfort. His silence was a paradox, a symbol of subordination, and at the same time a quiet assertion of control. The footmen, younger and less secure in their positions, lived a life of constant rehearsal. Their silence was not only etiquette, but survival. To speak at the wrong time, to draw notice, was to risk reprimand or dismissal. Their bodies bore the strain of long hours of standing, of carrying heavy trays with controlled elegance, of maintaining posture even when fatigue pressed upon them. And yet, when seen through the lens of history, they emerge not as faceless figures, but as men whose discipline shaped the very image of Edwardian refinement. At the tea table their work was invisible, and that was precisely the point. The Edwardian household thrived on a delicate balance. The upper classes performed leisure, while the servants performed labour disguised as absence. The drawing room was a stage, and the silence of the butler and footman was its backdrop. It framed the hostess's hospitality, the guests' conversation, and the ritual itself. Without that silence, the performance would have been fractured, its illusion broken. Yet what does history lose when it forgets the silent? In memoirs of the time, guests remembered the elegance of the table, the quality of the tea, the charm of conversation. Rarely did they write of the butler's stillness or the footman's careful movements. Their silence worked too well. It effaced them from the record. And so, when we reconstruct the past, we must ask ourselves, do we see the full picture, or only the part history was designed to show? The legacy of butlers and footmen lies not only in the service they provided, but also in the broader social structure they reflected. Their silence was the silence of a class system that demanded obedience without acknowledgement, duty without reward. It was the silence of an empire that consumed labour at home and abroad while presenting an image of stability and grace. The tea table, delicate and refined, was built upon this silence. To taste the tea was to sip the product of countless unseen hands, not only in London drawing rooms but across the globe. When the First World War came, this silence began to crumble. Servants left for the front or for industrial work, and many never returned to service. The great households, deprived of their invisible armies, could no longer sustain the rituals that had once seemed eternal. Afternoon tea survived, but the butler's silent authority and the footman's poised movements faded from daily life. Hotels, cafes, and middle-class parlours adopted the custom, but without the same invisible scaffolding of service. The silence, once essential, was replaced by the hum of public spaces, by waiters and waitresses who spoke openly, by a democratization that stripped the ritual of its old hierarchies. And yet, the memory of the butler and footman lingers. In popular imagination, they symbolize the order of a vanished age, dignified men in livery moving without sound, preserving the illusion of effortless grace. But beneath the romance lies reality. Men whose lives were bound by duty, whose labour was hidden by etiquette, whose silence carried the weight of an entire social order. As we close this story, one question remains. When we think of Edwardian tea, do we remember the taste of the tea itself, the elegance of the porcelain, the charm of the hostess? Or do we allow ourselves to hear at last the silence of the men who made it possible? In Edwardian parlours, tea was never simple. Each leaf and blend carried secrets of status, taste and quiet power over the household. To picture an Edwardian drawing room at 4, a clock is to picture not only polished silver and folded napkins, but also the unmistakable aroma of tea, warm, fragrant and carefully brewed. The ritual of afternoon tea in this era was built upon more than etiquette. It was built upon the leaves themselves, gathered from distant plantations and shipped across seas to fill the caddies of London households. The story of Edwardian tea blends is, therefore, not just a tale of taste, but a window into the global networks of empire, trade and habit that shaped daily life. For the Edwardian hostess, the choice of tea was a mark of refinement. Guests might never see the locked tin in which the butler kept the leaves, but they would taste the difference in their cups. A weak or bitter tea reflected poorly on the household. A A fragrant and balanced brew spoke of care, wealth, and discernment. Thus, the tea caddy was as important to Edwardian domestic life as the silver teapot itself. The most prized teas of the period came from India and Ceylon, regions under British control. Darjeeling, grown in the cool Himalayan foothills, was often called the champagne of teas. Its light floral taste suited the refined palate of Edwardian London, and it was often served to distinguished guests. Ceylon tea, stronger and brisker, was favoured for blends, providing body and depth to lighter leaves. Assam, rich and malty, brought a boldness that made it particularly useful in breakfast blends, but also appeared at afternoon tables, especially in households that preferred a fuller cup. Chinese teas, once dominant, had declined in favour but never disappeared. Keemun, with its smooth, slightly smoky flavour, still found its way into select blends, while green teas from China were occasionally offered as novelties. Yet the politics of empire ensured that Indian and Ceylon teas took pride of place. To serve them was to affirm Britain's global reach, to taste empire in a porcelain cup. Tea was rarely consumed in its pure form. Blending was both art and necessity. Merchants in London combined leaves from different regions to produce consistent flavour and strength. A household might favour a lighter afternoon blend, delicate enough not to overwhelm conversation, or a stronger variety suited to colder months. The butler, tasked with managing the household supplies, often knew the family's preference by heart. In some cases, hostesses took pride in selecting their own blends from fashionable tea shops in Piccadilly or Covent Garden, where tins gleamed in rows and clerks scooped leaves with practised flourish. The ritual surrounding these teas was strict. Leaves were measured with care, never guessed, always counted by spoonfuls. The teapot was warmed before brewing, lest the sudden heat crack its porcelain or dull the flavour. Water had to be freshly boiled, for water boiled twice was said to flatten the taste. The steeping time was judged with an almost scientific precision, long enough to draw out flavour, never so long as to allow bitterness. The butler might pour a small sample, holding it up to the light to check its colour, then taste it to judge its readiness. Only when it reached the exact balance of strength and clarity was it carried to the drawing room. The sugar and milk that accompanied these teas carried their own histories. Sugar, imported from Caribbean colonies, was costly but expected. Its presence at the table another sign of wealth and global connection. Milk was added according to preference, though etiquette dictated that the hostess pour tea first, then allow guests to add milk and sugar to taste. Some argued that milk should be poured before the tea, to prevent delicate porcelain from cracking. Others claimed that such a practice was common only in less refined households. The debate itself was part of Edwardian tea culture, a small but telling reminder that even the most ordinary details carried social meaning. Beyond taste, tea carried symbolism. To serve Darjeeling was to suggest delicacy. To serve Assam was to suggest strength. Blends were chosen not only for flavour, but for the message they conveyed. A fashionable London hostess might boast of a new Ceylon tea, acquired from a recent shipment, while a country household might remain loyal to a familiar blend. In each case, the choice of tea spoke volumes about class, wealth, and cultural alignment. And yet, in the quiet moment when a cup was raised to the lips, all these layers of meaning dissolved into experience. The warmth, the fragrance, the taste. These were universal, binding together guest and host, servant and mistress, in a ritual that transcended words. The leaves, grown on distant hillsides by workers who would never see London, carried with them a world of labour and empire. Yet in the Edwardian drawing room, they became a symbol of leisure, civility, and calm. The story of Edwardian tea leaves, then, is not only a story of taste but a story of connection, between London and India, between households and empires, between the visible ritual and the invisible hands that sustained it. But one must wonder, when the Edwardians savoured their tea, did they truly taste its global journey, or did the porcelain cup conceal the distance it had travelled? If Section 1 introduced the varieties of tea and their symbolic role in Edwardian households, Section 2 must take us further into the networks that supplied them, the merchants who shaped taste, and the quiet expectations that governed how these teas were selected and consumed. For behind the gentle clink of porcelain in the drawing room lay the machinery of empire and commerce, vast in scale, yet distilled into something as simple as a spoonful of leaves. In Edwardian London, the tea trade was both commonplace and extraordinary. Every grocer stocked some variety, yet the finest blends were sought from specialist merchants whose reputations stretched back to the 18th century. Names like Twinings, Fortnum, and Mason and Jacksons of Piccadilly carried weight among households that prided themselves on refinement. To shop at these establishments was not only to purchase tea, but also to participate in a tradition of quality. Clerks in long aprons stood behind polished counters, lifting lids from great chests, allowing customers to inhale the fragrance of distant lands. To select a blend here was an act of taste and status, one that signalled both discernment and means. Blending was central to Edwardian tea culture. Rarely did households serve a single origin tea in its pure state. Instead, merchants combined leaves from different regions to achieve consistency and balance. Assam provided strength, Darjeeling lent fragrance, and Ceylon added briskness. These blends allowed households to enjoy a reliable flavour year after year, even as harvests varied. The art of blending required not only knowledge of the leaves themselves, but also an understanding of what customers desired. Some preferred lighter afternoon teas, suitable for delicate palates, while others favoured stronger brews that could withstand milk and sugar. The butler played a role in these choices. Though he did not purchase tea directly, he advised his mistress and oversaw the household stores. He knew which blends suited his employer's taste, which were to be served to guests of rank, and which might be reserved for everyday use. His eye was trained to spot adulterated tea, a problem still present in the trade, as unscrupulous sellers sometimes mix leaves with fillers or dyes. In wealthy households, the butler's judgment was trusted, for the reputation of the family rested on the smallest details, including the quality of its tea. The social meaning of tea extended into subtle divisions. Offering Darjeeling, prized for its light floral notes, suggested refinement. Serving Assam, strong and malty, hinted at robustness and hospitality. Ceylon, with its brisk brightness, often appeared in blends that suited a wider range of guests. Chinese teas, though less common, retained a certain mystique. To serve Keeman or Gunpowder Green was to show cosmopolitan taste, though such choices were often reserved for adventurous households or fashionable gatherings. Sugar, too, carried meaning. By the Edwardian period, sugar had become affordable to many, but the way it was served reflected class. Refined households offered sugar in lumps, lifted delicately with silver tongs. Lesser households might still provide loose sugar, a detail that could betray their standing. Milk, though simple, carried its own etiquette. To add it before the tea was a practice often associated with servants, or those with less delicate porcelain. To add it after was the mark of refinement, though debates on this matter persisted endlessly. The rituals of preparation reinforced these divisions. A proper Edwardian hostess did not leave brewing to chance. She might not measure the leaves herself. That task often fell to the butler, but she presided over the pot, pouring with a steady hand. Guests watched, for pouring was as much a gesture of hospitality as it was a practical act. In some households, the butler brewed the tea out of sight, presenting it ready for service. In others, the mistress herself poured hot water over the leaves, displaying her role as custodian of refinement. Yet beyond the drawing rooms, the story of tea was one of empire. Ships carried leaves from India and Ceylon, steaming into the London docks, where warehouses brimmed with the fragrance of the East. Thousands of workers handled the cargo, unloading chests, weighing and packing them into smaller tins for merchants. The journey from plantation to teacup was long, and at each stage invisible labour sustained the ritual. Plantation workers, often poorly paid and labouring in harsh conditions, plucked leaves by hand, their work unseen by those who sipped in London parlours. The empire's might was distilled into a drink that symbolised leisure, civility and calm, even as it rested upon systems of control and exploitation. To Edwardian households this distance was invisible. Tea arrived as a finished product, ready to be measured and brewed. Its global journey was rarely discussed, for to dwell upon labour and trade would disturb the calm surface of etiquette. Yet we, looking back, cannot separate the porcelain cup from the plantations that filled it, nor the fragrant blend from the empire that sustained it. In this, tea served as a mirror of Edwardian society itself. Polished on the surface, orderly in its rituals, yet dependent upon vast networks of unseen labour. The butler and footman embodied this invisibility within the household, just as plantation workers embodied it across the globe. Guests tasted elegance, but what they consumed was the product of silence. Silence in the drawing room, silence in the colonies, silence in the histories that rarely recorded the hands that made the ritual possible. And so we ask, when the Edwardians lifted their cups and praised the smoothness of a blend, did they truly taste the empire behind it? Or did the art of blending conceal not only bitterness of leaves, but also the realities of their origin? As the Edwardian hostess poured the final cup, and the fragrance of warm leaves filled the drawing room, she likely gave little thought to the history sitting in her hand. For her, the choice of blend was part of the ritual of hospitality, a detail that distinguished her household as refined and well-ordered. Yet with hindsight, the tea she served, Darjeeling, Assam, Ceylon, or carefully balanced blends, reveal more than preference. They reveal a world in transition, a society poised between tradition and change, and a culture whose small habits reflected vast networks of empire and class. The legacy of Edwardian tea blends is twofold. On the one hand, they shaped taste in ways that endure to this day. The idea of a light afternoon tea versus a strong breakfast blend owes much to Edwardian practice. Merchants who once supplied drawing rooms eventually standardised these categories, offering them to the growing middle classes and later to the mass market. The blends that Edwardian butlers measured with silver spoons became the packets and boxes that fill modern shops. Their names, English breakfast, Earl Grey, Darjeeling, surviving as echoes of a vanished age. On the other hand, the very act of blending in Edwardian London reveals a cultural tendency toward concealment. Blending was meant to smooth variation, to provide consistency regardless of harvests or origins. In doing so, it erased the specific labour of distant workers, folding their efforts into a homogeneous whole. Guests in a London parlour sipped a balanced cup, unaware of whether the leaves came from Assam hillsides or Ceylon plantations. The blend was the product, not the place, and in this way, empire itself was tasted without being acknowledged. The symbolism of tea extended beyond the cup. It was a measure of civility, of calm, of Englishness itself. To drink Darjeeling at 4 o'clock was to participate in a ritual that defined cultural identity. Yet this identity was constructed upon global foundations. The Edwardians took for granted that tea would arrive in abundance, that blends would remain reliable, that merchants would supply exactly what was required. Few paused to consider that such abundance rested upon colonial systems of agriculture, transport and trade. Within the household, the selection of tea reinforced hierarchies. A butler's discretion in choosing a blend spoke of his professionalism, just as the mistress's ability to discuss tea shops in Piccadilly reflected her refinement. Guests noted the quality, even if silently, and households were judged accordingly. A bitter cup could leave a poor impression, just as a fragrant and balanced brew could elevate conversation. Tea was more than drink. It was social currency, a medium through which reputation was built and sustained. The cultural weight of Edwardian blends extended into their afterlife. As the First World War disrupted supply chains and drew servants into other forms of labour, the elaborate rituals of tea service began to wane. Yet the habit of tea drinking persisted, democratised and simplified. Hotels and tea rooms offered blends to the public, and by the mid-20th century tea had become a staple of daily life across Britain, no longer confined to drawing rooms but present in factories, offices and homes of every class. The consistency of blends, once a marker of refinement, became a necessity of mass consumption. Still, when one sips tea today, the Edwardian influence lingers. The very categories we use, the expectation of certain flavours at certain times of day, the association of tea with calm ritual, all trace back to the age when butlers measured leaves behind locked cabinets and hostesses discussed blends with pride. The names endure even if their context has changed. The quiet paradox remains. In drinking tea, the Edwardians affirmed both leisure and empire, both civility and exploitation. Their cups contained contradictions. Elegance in London, labour in Assam, refinement in Piccadilly, toil in Ceylon. Yet in the drawing room, only one layer was visible. The blend, smooth and consistent, offered as though the world itself had conspired to produce harmony. As we reflect on these teas, one question endures. When we lift a cup today, do we taste only the warmth and fragrance? Or can we sense the deeper story, the journey across oceans, the blending of leaves, the silence of those who harvested them? The Edwardians, sipping in porcelain cups beneath polished chandeliers, chose not to ask. But history, with its longer memory, compels us to listen to what their blends concealed. Every silver spoon and porcelain cup carried unspoken rules, where china met ritual and etiquette revealed the silent codes of Edwardian tea. In Edwardian London, the afternoon tea table was more than a place to sip and chat. It was a stage, carefully arranged to demonstrate refinement. At its centre, beyond the steaming pot of tea and the array of delicate sandwiches, lay two categories of objects that spoke volumes about status: the silverware and the china. To the casual guest, they might have appeared merely practical: a spoon to stir, a cup to hold liquid, a plate to carry food. But to the Edwardian hostess, and indeed to her guests, these objects were symbols, each chosen, polished, and placed according to rules that carried the weight of history and the burden of expectation. Silverware and china were not just tools, they were silent participants in the ritual of etiquette. Every fork, knife, spoon, and cup told a story of wealth, of taste, of heritage, and of connection to broader social traditions. For the Edwardians, whose world was increasingly defined by appearances and hierarchy, the objects on a tea table spoke almost as loudly as the words exchanged above it. The silver that gleamed on the table was rarely new. In many households it had been passed down through generations, carefully polished by servants until it shone with a muted glow. The teapot, heavy and engraved, was the centrepiece, flanked by a sugar bowl, cream jug, and sometimes a waste bowl for discarded leaves. Each piece had a function, and each was placed in a specific order. To deviate from this arrangement was to risk a silent rebuke from those who noticed. The spoons, small and delicately crafted, rested neatly upon saucers, their handles aligned at the same angle. Even their size mattered. Too large, and they appeared clumsy. Too small, and they suggested a lack of proper equipment. China, too, was selected with care. Porcelain from Staffordshire or bone china from Wedgwood often adorned the tables of the well-to-do, their fine translucence admired, when held up to the light. Patterns were chosen to reflect taste: floral designs for the fashionable, restrained whites, and gold trims for the dignified. Some households displayed entire sets, each cup and saucer matching perfectly, while others mixed inherited pieces with newer acquisitions, each carrying its own history. To drink from chipped china was unthinkable, for it implied negligence and a lowering of standards. The act of using silverware and china carried rules of its own. Guests were expected to hold cups delicately, never gripping them as one might a mug. The handle was to be held between finger and thumb, the little finger extended slightly but not exaggeratedly so. Spoons were not to be clinked loudly against porcelain, stirring had to be quiet, almost invisible. Plates were small, meant for dainty portions, and it was considered poor form to load them heavily. Napkins, folded neatly at each place, were lifted with restraint, used lightly, and placed back with care. Behind the scenes, the servants bore the burden of maintaining these objects. Silver required constant polishing, for even a hint of tarnish was a visible failure. Housemaids spent hours rubbing each piece with cloth and paste until their arms ached, knowing that any dullness would be noticed by the butler's eye. China, fragile and costly, demanded careful washing. A broken cup was not merely an inconvenience, it was a financial loss, and worse, a blemish on the household's image. In this way, the beauty of silverware and china was sustained by the invisible labour of those who never drank from them. The symbolism extended beyond mere appearance. To serve tea in silver and fine china was to anchor the ritual in tradition. These materials carried connotations of permanence and respectability. Silver spoke of wealth, accumulated and maintained. China spoke of refinement and global connection. For much of the finest porcelain was imported or inspired by Eastern designs. The table, then, was a map of status, each object a marker of where the household stood in the social order. Yet for all their symbolism, these objects also carried a certain fragility. Silver, tarnished if neglected, and china chipped if mishandled. They required care, attention, and constant vigilance. In this way, they mirrored Edwardian society itself, polished on the surface, fragile beneath. To present a flawless tea table was to affirm not only personal refinement, but also the stability of a world built on appearances. Guests noticed these details, even if they did not remark upon them. A hostess who served tea in mismatched cups or with tarnished spoons risked quiet judgment. reputation was built not only on conversation and hospitality, but on the unspoken language of objects. Silver and china gleaming in the soft light of an Edwardian afternoon were more than accoutrements. They were statements, unspoken but powerful, shaping how households were perceived and remembered. And so, as we begin to explore the role of silverware and china, one question arises. Were these objects merely tools of hospitality, or were they silent arbiters of status, shaping the very way Edwardians saw themselves and one another? If Section 1 brought us into the drawing room to witness the silver and porcelain set neatly upon the table, Section 2 invites us deeper, into the social world that sustained these objects, the merchants who supplied them, the traditions that gave them meaning, and the unseen rules that dictated their use. For silverware and china were never mere tools. They were bound up with identity, reputation, and the unyielding expectations of Edwardian society. The acquisition of silver and china in Edwardian London was not casual. Wealthy households often inherited these items, passing them down through generations as symbols of continuity. A teapot engraved with a family crest or monogram was not just functional, it was a statement of lineage. For newer households, eager to establish themselves, purchasing sets of silver and china became a way of signalling refinement. Shops on Oxford Street and Piccadilly displayed gleaming pieces in their windows, tempting customers with the promise of elegance. To invest in these items was to invest in one's social standing. Merchants and manufacturers played a crucial role. Renowned silversmiths such as Garrard or Asprey crafted teapots, cream jugs, and sugar tongs that adorned elite tables. These firms catered not only to aristocratic households, but also to the rising middle classes, who sought the trappings of refinement. Similarly, china manufacturers like Wedgwood, Royal Doulton and Spode marketed their wares as both beautiful and essential. Catalogues circulated widely, displaying floral patterns, gilt edges, and designs that promised to elevate the tea table into a statement of taste. Choosing a pattern was not merely aesthetic, it was a way of aligning oneself with fashion, tradition, or modernity. The symbolism of these objects extended beyond ownership. To use silver and china correctly was itself a form of social literacy. Guests were expected to recognise quality, to notice whether a spoon was sterling or plated, whether a cup was porcelain or earthenware. These judgments were rarely voiced, but they lingered in the minds of those present. A hostess who served tea in fine china demonstrated not only wealth, but also cultural awareness. One who failed to provide the proper setting risked subtle exclusion from higher circles. Silverware carried its own rituals. Sugar tongs, for example, were more than functional. They represented delicacy, for to take sugar with fingers was unthinkable. Spoons were to be placed quietly upon saucers after stirring, never left clinking in the cup. Even the tray upon which silver rested carried meaning. A polished silver tray, reflecting the glow of the drawing room, suggested abundance and stability. To see it dulled by tarnish was to glimpse negligence, a failure in the household's careful performance of refinement. China was equally laden with meaning. Its patterns reflected not only taste, but also cultural exchange. Many designs drew inspiration from Chinese or Japanese motifs, reinterpreted for Western markets. Blue and white porcelain remained popular, its delicate patterns symbolising both timeless beauty and the long history of trade with the East. Floral patterns in soft pastels spoke of femininity and fashion, while stark white china with gilt edges carried connotations of dignity and restraint. The choice of china was never neutral. It communicated subtle messages about the household's values, aspirations, and position in society. Behind the beauty lay labour. Housemaids spent long hours polishing silver, rubbing each surface until it gleamed, and washing china with care to avoid cracks or chips. A broken cup might mean wages docked or harsh reprimand. The fragility of these objects mirrored the fragility of service itself, a world where mistakes were costly and perfection demanded daily. For the servants, silver and china were not symbols of grace, but burdens to be maintained, their shine achieved through endless invisible work. Etiquette manuals of the time reinforced these expectations. They instructed hostesses on how to arrange silver, how to set china, how to serve without error. Guests were advised on how to hold cups, how to stir without noise, how to avoid spilling crumbs. These manuals reveal the extent to which the ritual of tea was codified, each object imbued with instructions that extended far beyond its basic use. In this way, silverware and china became part of a larger social script, one that demanded constant rehearsal and careful performance. The consequences of deviation were subtle but real. A guest who stirred too loudly, who placed a spoon improperly, or who held a cup with fingers through the handle rather than delicately pinching it, risked quiet ridicule. Likewise, a hostess who failed to provide polished silver or who produced chipped china revealed herself as inattentive, perhaps even unworthy of her social position. The tea table, for all its appearance of calm leisure, was a site of judgment, where every detail mattered. The role of silver and china also reveals the intersection of domestic life with empire. Much of the porcelain admired in Edwardian parlours traced its lineage to Chinese or Japanese traditions, adapted for British markets. Silver, mined and refined through global trade networks, carried with it the imprint of distant labour. In their gleam and translucence, these objects told a story not only of refinement, but also of Britain's global reach. Yet in the drawing room, these origins were concealed, transformed into symbols of civility and control. Thus, when we examine the role of silverware and china in Edwardian tea etiquette, we see more than tableware. We see instruments of status, tokens of identity, and reflections of a society obsessed with appearance. They reveal the labour of servants, the ambitions of hostesses, the judgment of guests, and the global currents of trade and empire. And so we must ask, when a guest lifted a porcelain cup to their lips, did they taste only the tea, or did they also, unknowingly, partake in the silent messages of silver and china, those objects that spoke without words? As the light of the Edwardian afternoon faded into evening and the last spoon was laid neatly back upon its saucer, the significance of silverware and china lingered in the room long after the guests had departed. These objects, polished and delicate, were not only implements of service but also vessels of meaning, quietly reinforcing the values and hierarchies of their age. To reflect upon them is to see how a society defined itself not only through grand speeches or sweeping reforms, but also through the quiet, everyday choreography of a tea table. The ritual use of silverware and china revealed Edwardian priorities. A polished spoon or a flawless cup was never simply about utility. It was about presenting a household as orderly, respectable, and refined. The shine of silver was a reflection of diligence, not of the hostess herself, who rarely handled polish, but of the unseen housemaids who laboured for hours to achieve that gleam. The smooth glaze of porcelain spoke of wealth and taste, yet also of fragility, for one slip of the hand could shatter both object and reputation. These objects carried the paradox of Edwardian life, solid in their symbolism, yet fragile in their substance. The memory of china was also cultural memory. Much of it drew on Eastern traditions, blue and white patterns inspired by Chinese porcelain, stylized florals echoing Japanese design, adapted for British markets and mass consumption. To place such designs on a tea table was to participate knowingly or not in a centuries-long history of global trade. Silver, too, had travelled, mined abroad, refined, shaped by British silversmiths, then polished in a London household until it gleamed with a sense of permanence. Both categories of objects, though admired for their refinement, were built on networks of labour and commerce far beyond the drawing room. The etiquette surrounding their use, meanwhile, was as much about control as about elegance. To stir without clinking, to hold a cup correctly, to place a spoon neatly upon a saucer, these were gestures of self-discipline. Guests demonstrated their belonging not by what they said, but by how they held their forks and touched their cups. In this way, silverware and china were not passive tools, but active arbiters of inclusion. They revealed who knew the code and who did not, who belonged and who lingered at the edges of refinement. Over time, these codes softened. The First World War, with its disruption of households and scattering of servants, loosened the grip of formality. The great stores of silver were sold, pawned, or stored away, while china services were broken up or simplified. Yet the memory of Edwardian etiquette endured. To this day, afternoon tea in Britain often conjures images of polished teapots and delicate cups, even when served in hotels or cafes far removed from drawing rooms. The cultural weight of silver and china lingers in the imagination, even as their original context has faded. The objects themselves often survived. Many Edwardian families preserved their silver sets and porcelain services, bringing them out for holidays or special occasions. Even when the exact rules of etiquette were forgotten, the association of these objects with tradition remained. A family heirloom teapot might sit unused in a cabinet, admired for its beauty more than its function, yet still carrying with it the aura of Edwardian afternoons. In such objects, the past continues to live, silently shaping how we think of civility, refinement, and the rituals that bind people together. And so, the role of silverware and china in Edwardian tea etiquette was not confined to utility, nor even to elegance. It was a reflection of society itself, of wealth and aspiration, of labour and invisibility, of fragility and permanence. Each object was a participant in the silent dialogue of the tea table, speaking of refinement, of belonging, and of the quiet discipline that defined an age. The question that remains for us is this: when we admire the elegance of Edwardian tea, do we see only the polished surfaces, or do we also glimpse the lives and labours that kept them shining? Silver and china, silent though they may be, continue to ask us to look closer, to hear what history tried to leave unsaid. In Edwardian tea rooms, no chair was chosen by chance. Every seat whispered of rank, rivalry, and the hidden order of society. At first glance, the Edwardian tea table seemed a simple affair. Guests arrived, they were greeted warmly, and they sat to enjoy tea and conversation. Yet beneath this apparent informality lay a carefully constructed order. Seating at an Edwardian tea was never random. It reflected the values of a society obsessed with hierarchy, subtle signals of rank, and the silent language of placement. Who sat where, and why, could shape the entire mood of the afternoon. The mistress of the house presided over this arrangement. As hostess, she occupied the seat closest to the teapot, usually at the centre or head of the table. From this vantage, she controlled the flow of the ritual, pouring the first cups, offering plates of food, and directing conversation with gentle authority. Her placement was never in question. It was the anchor of the gathering. But around her, the positioning of guests required thought, foresight, and tact. High-ranking or honoured guests were placed within easy reach of the hostess, often to her right or left. This allowed her to attend to them personally, ensuring their cups were refilled promptly and their comfort maintained. To be placed near the hostess was a mark of distinction, signalling respect and recognition. Lesser guests, or those less central to the occasion, were seated further away, still included in the circle without written rules or overt direction. Guests did not receive cards telling them where to sit as at a formal dinner. Instead, the hostess's gestures, the arrangement of chairs, and the quiet guidance of servants ensured that everyone found their place. To the untrained eye, it appeared spontaneous. To those within the culture, it was a silent language understood instinctively. This careful placement reflected more than hospitality. It reflected a world-view in which everyone had a place, and to disrupt that order was to risk discomfort. The tea table, like Edwardian society itself, rested upon hierarchy. Guests accepted their positions, whether near the hostess or at the periphery, understanding that these arrangements carried meaning. To be seated at the edge was not necessarily an insult, but it was a reminder of one's standing. And so, as we begin to explore the question of seating, we must ask, was the Edwardian tea table truly a place of leisure, or was it a mirror of society's strict divisions, where every chair spoke of rank, every placement of authority, and every gesture of hierarchy? In Edwardian tea culture, the placement of chairs and the order of service were never arbitrary. Behind the apparent simplicity of guests gathering around a table lay a system of subtle codes, a choreography of hierarchy, gender, age, and relationship. To understand the full depth of this practice, one must step into the mindset of an Edwardian hostess, for whom every gesture at the tea table was both social strategy and performance. The hostess's first consideration was rank. A duchess visiting from the country did not sit at the periphery of the tea table. She was guided to a seat near the hostess, her presence honoured and displayed. Similarly, an older family friend of a high standing might be placed close to the centre, where conversation naturally revolved around her. By contrast, a younger cousin or less prominent acquaintance might find themselves gently directed to the outer circle, still welcome but not given precedence. The table thus became a map of social order, with proximity to the hostess serving as a measure of importance. Age carried its own influence. In a culture that valued respect for elders, older women were often placed near the hostess, even if their social rank was not especially high. To seat them at the periphery would have been considered a breach of courtesy. This respect was not extended equally, however. Young men, even those of good families, could find themselves relegated to the edges if their presence was deemed secondary to the event. The tea table was a place where the quieter authority of older women was recognised, even in a society that often limited their power in public life. Gender dynamics shaped seating as well. Though afternoon tea was considered a feminine domain, men were frequently present, especially in mixed gatherings. The placement of men was often strategic. A visiting gentleman might be seated beside a lively woman to ensure engaging conversation. Married couples were rarely placed side by side, for it was assumed they had little need of each other's company in such settings. Instead, the hostess deliberately separated them, weaving connections among her guests that might spark interest, novelty, or alliance. In this sense, the seating arrangement functioned as a kind of social weaving, threads drawn together to form a temporary pattern of harmony. The servants, too, understood these silent rules. A butler or footman offering a tray of sandwiches did not simply move clockwise around the room. He began with the highest-ranking guest, offering first to the honoured lady or gentleman, then to those nearby before making his way to the rest. Refilling cups followed the same order. To serve a lesser guest before a greater one would have been a breach not only of etiquette, but of the very social fabric the tea was designed to reinforce. The tea table thus became a living diagram of Edwardian order, enacted silently through service. This order was not rigid for its own sake. It served the broader purpose of harmony. A clever hostess knew that social events could founder on ill-placed chairs. To seat two individuals with a history of disagreement side by side was to risk uncomfortable silence, or, worse, a quarrel. To cluster shy guests together was to invite stagnation in conversation. Instead, she distributed her guests like pieces on a chessboard, balancing personality with rank, energy with restraint. An honoured guest of stiff demeanour might be placed beside someone known for wit, ensuring liveliness without disrespect. In this way, seating arrangements became a form of management, invisible to most but central to the event's success. The symbolism of seating extended beyond the room. To be placed near the hostess could be recounted later as a mark of favour, a quiet signal of one standing within the household circle. To be seated far from her might also be noted, not as an insult necessarily, but as a reminder of one's lesser importance. These judgments rarely appeared in words, but they lingered in memory, shaping how individuals viewed themselves and one another. For the Edwardians, who lived in a world where reputation was everything, even the placement of a chair could alter perception. The arrangement of the table itself reinforced these dynamics. At larger gatherings, when more than one table was set, the hostess ensured that each carried its own hierarchy. The first table was the place of honour, presided over by herself or a senior relative, while the second or third table accommodated guests of lower rank or less intimate connection. Even here rules applied. A young woman hoping to make her social debut understood that placement at the first table signalled opportunity, while placement further away suggested she was not yet central to the circle. What is striking is how naturally these arrangements were accepted. Guests rarely protested or questioned their placement. They understood that the tea table reflected a world in which everyone had a place, and that to challenge one's position would be to challenge the very fabric of social life. This acceptance reveals much about Edwardian culture, its emphasis on order, its comfort with hierarchy, and its reliance on subtle signals rather than overt declarations. And yet, the tea table also allowed for small acts of kindness or defiance. A hostess who wished to honour a less prominent guest might place them closer to her, signalling favour that defied strict rank. A servant, noticing a guest neglected in conversation, might linger slightly longer when offering food, granting them a moment of attention. These small adjustments did not overturn the system, but they revealed its flexibility. The tea table, like society itself, was not a prison but a framework, one that could be bent gently without breaking. As we step back from this picture, one truth becomes clear. The Edwardian tea table was not only a site of refreshment, but also a map of power and connection. Its seating arrangements reflected not only who mattered in that moment, but also how Edwardians conceived of society itself, layered, ordered, and bound together by silent codes. But we are left to wonder, when the tea was over and the chairs were returned to their places, did the guests remember the taste of the tea more vividly, or the subtle message of where they had been asked to sit? By the time the cups had been emptied and the plates of sandwiches reduced to crumbs, the seating arrangement had already done its work. The guests might not have spoken of it openly, but each left the drawing room with a quiet sense of their place. Some carried the satisfaction of having been seated near the hostess, honoured with proximity and attention. Others carried the subtle reminder that they had been positioned at the periphery, welcome but not central. In this way, the chairs at an Edwardian tea table did more than hold bodies, they held meaning. The Edwardian world was built on such meanings. Hierarchy was not simply imposed by law or title, it was enacted daily in rituals like afternoon tea. Seating arrangements were one of the ways this order was reinforced, gently but firmly, through gestures so ordinary that they seemed natural. To modern eyes, it may appear trivial, a matter of who sat where. Yet to Edwardians, who lived in a culture acutely sensitive to rank and reputation, these placements mattered. They were part of the invisible grammar of society, shaping relationships and expectations with every gathering. The reflection of hierarchy in the tea table was mirrored in broader society. Just as the honoured guests sat near the hostess, so too did elites sit closer to the centre of power in the nation. Just as younger or lesser guests were placed at the edges, so too were the less privileged kept at the margins of influence. The tea table was not a parody of Edwardian society, it was its microcosm. To sit in a drawing room was to participate, consciously or not, in the rehearsal of the entire social order. Yet the tea table was not only about hierarchy, it was also about harmony. A skilled hostess did not merely replicate status, she mediated it. By arranging seats with care, she created an atmosphere where conversation flowed, where silences were filled, and where tensions were softened. Her choices could draw together strangers, balance strong personalities with quieter ones, and ensure that her tea was remembered not only for its silver and china, but for its ease. This aspect of seating arrangements reveals another truth of Edwardian society. While hierarchy was firm, it was also managed with tact. Refinement was not only about order, but also about the art of making order seem pleasant. The role of servants in this arrangement should not be forgotten. They too understood the order of seating, for it governed their service. They knew which guest must be offered sandwiches first, whose cup must never remain empty, and whose needs took precedence. Their movements reinforced the arrangement, translating invisible rank into visible service. Yet for all their awareness, they themselves never sat at the table. Their place was fixed, always standing, always serving, always absent from the circle they helped sustain. The arrangement of chairs thus reinforced not only differences among guests, but also the larger divide between those seated and those serving. As the Edwardian era faded, the rigidity of these rituals softened. The disruptions of war, the decline of large households, and the democratization of leisure loosened the grip of formality. Seating at tea became more casual, more spontaneous, less bound by the codes of hierarchy. Yet the memory of Edwardian order lingers. Even today, hosts often think carefully about where to place guests at gatherings, seeking both to honour and to harmonise, even if the rules are unspoken. The instinct to arrange, to signal through placement remains with us, a quiet inheritance of Edwardian etiquette. And so we are left with a question. When we imagine the Edwardian tea table, do we see merely chairs and cups? Or do we glimpse the invisible lines of rank and recognition that shaped its every detail? The drawing room, with its polished silver and fragrant tea, was more than a place of refreshment. It was a mirror of a society where place mattered, and where to know one's place, whether near the hostess or at the edge of the circle, was to know oneself within the larger order of things. In Edwardian tea service, even the teapot moved with ceremony. Each slow pour and passing carried unspoken power, grace, and quiet authority. The Edwardian tea table was a place of stillness wrapped in ceremony. From the silver trays to the dainty sandwiches, every detail carried meaning, but none so much as the act of pouring tea itself. To pour was not merely to fill a cup, it was to signal hospitality, refinement, and control. The teapot, often heavy with silver or delicate with porcelain, was the true centre of the ritual. How it was handled, who poured from it, and how it was passed spoke volumes about the household, its hostess, and the very values of Edwardian society. The hostess presided, her hand steady as she lifted the pot. In a society governed by etiquette, pouring tea was a gesture of authority, a sign that she controlled the flow of the gathering. Though the butler and footman might carry trays or refill pots in the pantry, it was the hostess who poured the first cup. This act was more than symbolic. It allowed her to demonstrate grace, composure, and attentiveness to her guests. Every movement, and the tilt of the pot, the pace of the stream, the careful avoidance of drips, was observed, however discreetly, by those seated around her. The ritual began slowly. The teapot, warmed beforehand with a rinse of boiling water, was filled with steeped leaves, measured with precision. As the lid was replaced and the pot carried to the table, anticipation filled the room. The hostess, seated at the centre or head of the table, drew it close. Guests sat with cups and saucers poised, waiting not with impatience but with quiet attention. The sound of liquid pouring into porcelain, a gentle trickle, soft but distinct, was the opening note of the ceremony. The order of pouring reflected hierarchy. Honoured guests were served first, beginning with the person of highest rank or distinction. From there, the hostess worked outward, ensuring each cup was filled in turn. No guest was left to serve themselves unless expressly encouraged. The act of receiving tea was itself an acknowledgement of the hostess's care, and to pour one's own was considered poor form, a breach of the ritual's balance. Passing the teapot followed its own etiquette. If the gathering was large, or if multiple teapots were set on the table, the hostess might allow others to pour after her. Yet even then, the passing of the pot carried rules. It was never slid across the table, always lifted, always carried, always placed gently within reach of the next person. The handle was turned outward for ease. The spout never aimed directly at a guest, as this was thought impolite. To pass the teapot carelessly was to betray inattentiveness, a small but telling flaw. The ritual of pouring extended beyond simple mechanics. Conversation often paused or softened while the hostess poured. Guests waited for their cups to be filled before resuming topics of politics, fashion, or travel. In these brief silences, the ceremony itself spoke. The act of pouring created rhythm, moments of quiet punctuating the afternoon like rests in a piece of music. The clink of spoon against saucer, the faint steam rising, the movement of the pot from guest to guest. All of this formed part of the atmosphere, unremarkable in isolation yet deeply significant in sum. Behind the hostess's gesture lay the preparation of servants. The butler had ensured that the blend was properly steeped, that the pot was warmed, and that hot water stood ready in a kettle nearby. Footmen waited at the edges of the room, prepared to carry the pot back to the pantry if more leaves were needed, or to replace it with a fresh pot at the hostess's signal. The smoothness of the ritual depended not only on the hostess's grace but also on the silent coordination of those who remained invisible. To spill while pouring, to drip upon the tablecloth, or to overfill a cup was more than a minor accident. It disrupted the image of calm. Hostesses practiced their pouring, ensuring a steady hand. The design of the teapot itself mattered. Spouts were crafted to prevent drips, handles shaped for balance. Silver pots, heavy but stable, were prized for their elegance and reliability. Porcelain pots, lighter but more fragile, demanded precision. Each carried risks and rewards, and each reflected the taste of the household. Guests too had their role. Once their cups were filled, they were expected to lift them with care, never gulping or blowing upon hot tea. To stir was permitted, but always quietly, spoon touching porcelain without sound. Cups were held delicately, fingers resting lightly upon the handle, the saucer supporting the cup at all times. To place the cup back upon the table without the saucer was a lapse. These rules, unspoken but understood, ensured that the ritual unfolded without disruption. The slowness of the ritual was part of its charm. Unlike coffee houses or taverns where drinks were served quickly and conversation was lively, afternoon tea was marked by restraint. The measured pace of pouring and passing reminded participants that this was not merely about refreshment. It was about civility, about demonstrating that one had the time and composure to honour tradition. To rush the tea was to undermine its purpose. Its very slowness was its refinement. And so, as we enter into the ritual of pouring and passing, we glimpse the heart of Edwardian afternoon tea. It was a ceremony in which every gesture carried meaning, every movement reinforced order, and every pause invited reflection. The teapot was not only a vessel of liquid, it was a vessel of etiquette, civility, and unspoken messages. Yet one must ask, when the Edwardians paused to watch the tea pour into porcelain, did they see only a beverage, or did they also see in the slow stream of amber liquid the reflection of their own ordered world? The ritual of pouring tea may appear to modern eyes as little more than a domestic courtesy. Yet in Edwardian London, the act was so weighted with meaning that it became a miniature performance of society itself. The teapot was not only a vessel, but a symbol of civility, and the order in which it was poured, the manner in which it was passed, and the rules governing. Its use revealed an entire language of status, respect, and discipline. At the centre of this ritual was the hostess, whose authority was quietly affirmed every time she lifted the pot. Though men might hold political power in the Edwardian world, the tea table was a domain of feminine control. Here, the hostess presided, and her competence was judged in the steadiness of her hands, the attentiveness of her gestures, and the grace with which she attended to each guest. Her ability to pour without spilling, to serve in the correct order, and to do so without appearing hurried was a sign of her refinement. Guests, however politely they disguised it, observed these details with care. The order of pouring itself reflected the hierarchies of society. The most honoured guest, a titled lady, a distinguished visitor, or a senior relative, was served first. The cup was placed before them with courtesy, sugar and milk offered next, and only after their satisfaction was the pot turned toward others. Younger or less important guests waited patiently, aware that their turn would come. None complained, for the act of waiting was itself part of the ritual, a silent acknowledgement of order. To serve a lesser guest before a greater one would have been a breach, not only of etiquette, but of the very principle upon which Edwardian life rested, that everyone had their place, and that order must be respected. Passing the teapot followed this same rhythm of courtesy. It was never shoved or slid, never treated as a mere object. Instead, it was lifted carefully, its handle turned outward so that the next person could grasp it easily, its spout angled away to avoid impropriety. The simple act of positioning the spout carried meaning. Etiquette manuals warned against pointing it at a guest, for this was considered a form of rudeness, a failure of attentiveness. Even in silence, the placement of the pot conveyed respect. The role of servants in this ritual was both vital and invisible. The butler ensured that the tea was brewed to proper strength, testing its colour against porcelain before approving it for service. Footmen stood ready at the edges of the room, prepared to carry the pot away when it cooled, or to bring a fresh one at the hostess's signal. If the gathering was large, multiple teapots might circulate, each attended by servants who ensured that guests were never left without. Yet servants themselves did not pour. That act belonged to the hostess, a symbol of her authority and her personal hospitality. The servants sustained the ritual, but she presided over it. There were rules too for the guests. One did not reach for the teapot unbidden, nor attempt to serve oneself unless the hostess indicated it. To do so would be seen as impatience, even disrespect. Guests accepted their turn with quiet composure, stirring their cups gently, never clinking spoon against porcelain, never blowing upon the hot liquid. They knew that their role was to receive, not to command. The teapot's slow journey around the table reinforced this principle. Civility required patience, restraint, and attentiveness to others. The symbolism of the teapot extended further still. Its design spoke of the household's taste. A silver teapot, heavy and engraved, suggested wealth and permanence. A porcelain teapot, delicate and patterned, spoke of refinement and fashion. To use a common earthenware pot would have been unthinkable in respectable Edwardian society, for the teapot was the centrepiece of the table. Its material, its weight, its gleam, all contributed to the image the household wished to project. What is striking is the slowness of it all. The pace of pouring and passing was measured, deliberate. In a world increasingly defined by speed, by trains, by telegrams, by factories, the tea ritual preserved slowness as a virtue. To pause for tea was to step outside the rush of modernity, to reclaim a moment of calm order. Each guest waited their turn, each cup was poured with care, and the deliberate pace itself became a marker of civility. To rush would have been vulgar. To linger was refinement. The pauses created by the ritual shaped the flow of conversation. Topics rose and fell in time with the passing of the pot. A silence might descend as the hostess poured, only to be broken again once the cups were filled. In this way, the teapot acted as a conductor, regulating not only the distribution of liquid but also the rhythm of the gathering. Its slow movement structured the afternoon, a quiet reminder that civility was built upon patience. And so, in Edwardian London, the act of pouring and passing the teapot became more than a domestic habit. It became a reflection of values: hierarchy, respect, attentiveness, patience, and control. To participate was to affirm those values consciously or not. To pour, to wait, to pass, to receive. Each gesture reinforced the order upon which Edwardian society rested. But one must ask, when the last cup was filled and the teapot returned to its stand, did the guests reflect on the tea itself? Or did they carry away a deeper impression, the memory of an ordered world mirrored in the slow, deliberate movement of a single vessel around a table? By the end of the Edwardian afternoon, when the silver tray was carried away and the drawing room settled back into stillness, the teapot had already performed its quiet duty. Its slow circulation around the table, its measured pause, and its silent reinforcement of etiquette had done more than refresh. It had affirmed the structure of the household and the values of a society that prized order above spontaneity. In its weight and fragility, the teapot embodied Edwardian life itself, polished on the surface, bound by invisible rules beneath. The cultural meaning of this ritual extended beyond the drawing room. In many ways, the teapot was a symbol of domestic stability. To pour tea for guests was to demonstrate that one's household was orderly, that one's staff was attentive, and that civility reigned within those walls. A household that could not manage tea gracefully risked whispers of incompetence, just as a hostess who poured clumsily risked being remembered less for her conversation than for her spills. The ritual may have seemed small, but its implications were wide. For servants, the teapot represented discipline. They never poured at the table, that was the hostess's right, but they sustained the illusion by keeping pots ready, water boiling, and blends prepared at the proper strength. Their invisible labour allowed the hostess to perform her visible role. Without them, the ritual would falter. The butler, footmen and maids ensured that the pot was always warm, the tea always fresh, and the table always orderly. Their silence matched the silence of the vessel itself, carrying meaning without acknowledgement. For guests, the teapot carried expectations: to wait one's turn, to stir quietly, to hold the cup correctly. These were all acts of restraint, a demonstration that one belonged within the code of civility. The slowness of the ritual demanded patience, and patience was itself a mark of refinement. In waiting, guests demonstrated deference to hierarchy. In receiving, they acknowledged the authority of the hostess. Thus, the teapot did more than distribute liquid. It distributed recognition, reinforcing place and order as surely as the seating plan or the polish of the silver. As the Edwardian era drew to a close, the teapot's symbolism began to shift. The upheavals of the First World War broke apart many of the households that had sustained elaborate tea rituals. Servants left, fortunes diminished, and formalities loosened. Tea survived, but its rituals grew simpler. No longer did every gathering require silver pots and polished trays. Enamel kettles and plain ceramics became common. The hostess still poured, but the act lost some of its ceremonial weight. Yet the memory of the Edwardian ritual lingered. In hotels and tea rooms, where afternoon tea became democratized, the slow pace of pouring and serving still evoked refinement, even when performed by waitresses rather than hostesses. Today, when one speaks of afternoon tea, it is often the Edwardian image that comes to mind. A polished teapot, cups arranged neatly, conversation unfolding in a calm rhythm. The ritual of pouring remains central, even if the rules are less rigid. To pour tea for another is still to offer hospitality. To wait one's turn is still to show patience. The Edwardian values of attentiveness, civility, and composure continue to echo through the simple act of a tilted pot. What the Edwardians may not have fully recognised, or perhaps chose not to recognise, is how deeply the ritual revealed their society. The teapot's slow circulation mirrored their acceptance of hierarchy, its careful handling mirrored their fear of disorder, and its silence mirrored the silence of the servants and labourers upon whose work the ritual depended. The very qualities that made the ritual elegant also made it a reflection of control. And so, in closing, we might see the teapot not only as an object of porcelain or silver, but as a cultural mirror. In its weight, we feel the weight of social expectation. In its fragility, we glimpse the fragility of a world soon to be shaken by war. In its slow, deliberate passing, we hear the rhythm of a society content for the moment to rest in order. Yet one question lingers. When the Edwardians lifted their cups and savoured the calm, did they realise that what they tasted was not merely tea, but their own reflection? A reflection poured slowly, passed carefully, and sipped in silence. At Edwardian afternoon tea, words mattered as much as the tea itself. Unspoken rules shaped every pause, every glance, every delicate reply. In Edwardian London, the clink of spoon against porcelain and the fragrance of steaming tea were only part of the ritual. Equally important, though less visible, was conversation. Not merely what was said, but how it was said, when and to whom. Afternoon tea was not designed for argument or confession. It was a stage for refinement, where words, like the silver and china, were polished, measured, and presented with care. To converse at tea was to participate in an unspoken code, a choreography of speech as intricate as the arrangement of cups and saucers. Guests arriving at the tea table understood these expectations instinctively, for they had been raised within them. Conversation had to be light, never heavy, engaging but never too personal. To launch into politics or business was frowned upon unless the company was unusually intimate and the hostess herself introduced the subject. More commonly, talk revolved around art, society, fashion, books or travels, topics that amused without dividing. The goal was not debate but harmony. The tea table was meant to soothe, not to unsettle. The hostess presided over this verbal exchange as carefully as she presided over the pouring of tea. She guided the flow of words, steering guests toward pleasant topics, smoothing over awkward pauses, and redirecting any conversation that strayed too far into impropriety. Her role was subtle but central. A well-conducted tea was remembered less for its refreshments than for its atmosphere, and that atmosphere depended largely on her skill in conversation. Politeness shaped every word. Interrupting was a breach of manners, as was speaking too loudly or dominating the table. Guests were expected to take turns, to listen as much as they spoke, and to phrase even their disagreements in the softest terms. Wit was prized, but sharpness was discouraged. A clever remark that amused was welcome, a biting one that embarrassed was not. In this way, the tea table became a school of restraint, where self-control was valued above brilliance. Silence too played a role. Unlike dinner, where conversation was expected to flow steadily, tea allowed for pauses. The act of pouring, stirring or sipping provided natural breaks in the rhythm, moments of quiet that were not considered awkward, but rather part of the ritual's calm. Guests understood that conversation did not need to be constant. It was enough that it be pleasant when it occurred and silent when it did not. The subjects considered suitable reflected Edwardian values. Fashionable novels, plays at the theatre, exhibitions at the Royal Academy, these were safe ground. Gardens and travel were also popular, for they invited description without risk of controversy. Personal matters, however, were to be handled delicately. To ask about someone's health was acceptable, but to press further into illness or finances was intrusive. Courtship or marital troubles were never discussed, save in the vaguest of terms. The tea table was not a confessional but a salon of civility. Guests, therefore, measured their words as carefully as the hostess measured tea leaves. They sought to appear cultured but not pretentious, lively but not vulgar, intelligent but not argumentative. To misstep, to boast too much, to speak too freely, or to linger on a subject deemed unsuitable, was to risk quiet judgment. Just as a tarnished spoon or a chipped cup could mar the table, so too could careless words mar the atmosphere. Servants reinforced this code through their silence. Moving quietly around the table, they reminded guests by their presence that restraint was required. To speak too freely before the staff was considered indiscreet, for words once overheard could not be withdrawn. Thus, the very structure of the household encouraged the moderation of speech. The unspoken rules of conversation at tea reveal a great deal about Edwardian society. This was an age obsessed with appearance, with order, with the smooth surface of civility. Conversation, like silver and china, was part of that surface. It was polished, controlled, and designed to reflect well upon the household. Beneath it, deeper feelings and conflicts might exist, but they were kept hidden, unspoken, beneath the calm veneer. And so, as we step into the Edwardian drawing room and listen to the murmur of voices over cups of tea, we hear more than idle chatter. We hear the quiet reinforcement of an entire worldview, one that valued harmony over truth, appearance over candour, and the discipline of restraint above all else. Yet one must ask, when the Edwardians left the tea table, did they feel refreshed by the harmony of their words, or stifled by the silence of all that remained unsaid? If the opening section introduced us to the calm surface of Edwardian conversation, here we move beneath that surface, into the delicate mechanics by which the ritual was sustained. Words at the tea table were not spoken casually. They were selected, polished, and arranged with care, as much a part of etiquette as the placement of a silver spoon. To understand Edwardian tea fully, one must listen not only to what was said, but to how silence, tone, and subject all work together to uphold civility. The hostess was the conductor of this verbal orchestra. Just as she poured the first cup, she also set the tone of conversation. If she introduced the subject of a new novel, guests followed with comments and questions. If she inquired about travel, the conversation turned to rail journeys or seaside resorts. She steered with a lightness, never dictating but guiding, ensuring that the talk remained pleasant. A skilled hostess could revive a flagging discussion with a timely anecdote, or gently deflect an uncomfortable subject with a shift in attention. Her success as a hostess was measured less by the food she served than by the atmosphere she created, and words were her primary tool. Guests, meanwhile, played their parts with equal attentiveness. They avoided monologues, which were considered selfish, and instead sought to include others. A well-phrased question was a mark of good breeding, for it drew others into the circle. To ask after someone's recent visit to the theatre, or to comment on a shared acquaintance's garden, allowed conversation to flow naturally without probing too deeply. Self-control was key. The Edwardian tea table was a place where wit sparkled only briefly and gently, never in a way that could cut or embarrass. Certain subjects were unspoken taboos. Politics, for instance, was generally avoided, unless all present were in firm agreement, and the hostess herself permitted it. Even then, the discussion was more likely to centre on personalities than on policies. Money was another forbidden subject, considered vulgar to raise in polite company. Religion, too, was best left outside the drawing room, lest it disturb the harmony of the afternoon. In their place, safe topics reigned: books, plays, gardens, fashions, travel. The very limits of conversation reveal what Edwardian society valued: smoothness, restraint, and the avoidance of discord. Yet within these boundaries, there was room for subtle performance. To mention a recent trip to the continent was not only to describe a journey, it was to signal one's wealth and taste. To discuss a fashionable play was to demonstrate cultural awareness. Even the choice of anecdotes, and whether humorous, moral, or observational, reflected one's place in society. Words were tokens of refinement, exchanged carefully to maintain balance. The pauses between words mattered too. The act of pouring tea created natural interruptions, moments when conversation softened or ceased altogether. These silences were not failures, but part of the rhythm, a reminder that restraint was as important as expression. Guests sipped quietly, the clink of spoon against saucer filling the space where voices might otherwise intrude. In such moments, the room itself seemed to breathe, the ritual continuing in silence as much as in speech. Servants reinforced these dynamics through their discreet presence. A butler entering with a tray reminded guests to guard their tongues, for indiscretion before staff was considered careless. Even the soft sound of a footman moving across the carpet could redirect conversation away from topics better left unspoken. In this way, the social order extended into speech. Words, like objects, were polished for display, never left raw or careless. The art of conversation at tea was also a means of inclusion and exclusion. Those who mastered the codes, who spoke with charm, restraint, and attentiveness, were welcomed into the circle. Those who blundered, who spoke too freely, too loudly, or too bluntly, found themselves quietly judged. remembered less for their company than for their lapses. Just as chipped china reflected poorly on a household, so too did careless words reflect poorly on a guest. The tea table was forgiving in appearance but exacting in memory. In this way, the unspoken rules of conversation at tea mirrored the wider Edwardian worldview. Harmony was prized above truth, appearance above candour, restraint above passion. Words, like tea itself, were poured slowly, measured carefully, and consumed with attention. To converse at the tea table was to practice the art of being social without being candid, present without being intrusive, lively without being disruptive. And so, as we listen to these Edwardian voices, gentle, measured, and polished, we are left to wonder, were their silences chosen freely, or imposed by the weight of a society that feared what might be spoken if the rules were ever set aside? When the last cups had been drained and the guests rose to depart, what lingered from an Edwardian tea was not only the taste of sandwiches or the fragrance of Darjeeling. It was the memory of conversation, or more precisely the memory of how conversation had been conducted. Every pause, every choice of subject, every carefully measured phrase was part of a larger performance, one that affirmed the values of an age obsessed with restraint, harmony, and civility. The tea table offered no space for argument, confession, or bluntness. Instead, it provided a stage upon which society rehearsed its ideals. The act of speaking at tea was less about communication than about reflection, reflecting refinement, culture, and self-control. Guests left with the impression not of revelation but of polish, as though their very words had been polished like the silver spoons upon the table. This ritual reflected the Edwardian fear of disruption. At a time when society faced undercurrents of change, industrial unrest, women's suffrage, tensions within empire, the tea table remained a sanctuary of calm. Conversation was the mechanism by which disorder was kept at bay. By restricting speech to safe topics, by discouraging debate, by rewarding restraint, the ritual affirmed a world in which appearances were preserved, even as pressures built beyond the drawing room walls. The silence of forbidden subjects was as telling as the words that were spoken. The hostess's role in guiding this calm cannot be overstated. She was not merely the pourer of tea, but the guardian of harmony. Her subtle redirections, her timely anecdotes, her light laughter when a subject threatened to stray, these were acts of quiet control. To maintain conversation without friction was to demonstrate mastery of her social role. In this sense, the tea table was her stage, and conversation her instrument of authority. For the guests, the codes of conversation provided both safety and limitation. To know what was expected, to avoid politics, religion and money, to favour travel, art and gardens, offered a script that ensured acceptance. Yet these rules also constrained. To long for candour, to wish to speak freely of conviction or frustration, was to feel the weight of silence. Many Edwardians must have left tea tables with thoughts unspoken, sentences swallowed, feelings set aside. Their calm was real, but it was also constructed. The legacy of these conversational codes endured beyond the Edwardian age. Even as society modernised, the instinct to keep certain topics unsuitable for the table persisted. The notion of polite conversation, light, harmonious, safe, still echoes in modern gatherings where certain subjects remain avoided in the name of civility. The Edwardian tea table may be gone, but its rules live on, subtle and enduring. Looking back, one sees how conversation at tea was a mirror of Edwardian identity. Polished, graceful and restrained, it embodied a culture that valued appearances above conflict, harmony above honesty. It was a performance, but one taken seriously, for in such performances the stability of society was enacted daily. To speak at tea was to affirm belonging, to remain silent at the right moment was to affirm discipline, and to leave with reputation intact was to affirm success. And so we are left with a final thought. When Edwardian guests spoke over tea, did they believe they were engaging in true dialogue, or did they understand, consciously or not, that they were playing a part in a larger ritual, one in which silence mattered as much as speech? Their words, so carefully chosen, remind us that history is not only written in battles or laws, but also in the quiet murmur of drawing rooms, where society defined itself in the smallest, most measured exchanges.